November 1975. Southern Angola. The radio crackles with something that makes no sense. A Cuban armored column has stopped advancing. Not because of airstrikes, not because of South African artillery, because of something the Soviet advisors cannot identify. The vehicle is too small. The gun is too long. It matches nothing in their recognition charts. By the time the charts are updated, 7 of their armored vehicles are already on fire. The crew that killed them were teenagers. The vehicle they drove weighed 6 tons. The Soviets had been sending 32-ton tanks into Angola for months. Nobody had told them to worry about a wheeled police car from France. That was the first mistake. It would not be the last. The vehicle had a nickname: South African conscripts, 18 and 19 years old, navigating on tourist road maps from a Caltex petrol station, called it the Noddy Car. Not because it was fast, not because it was powerful, because it looked absurd. A narrow gray turret on a four-wheeled hull, the size of a large family car, 12 millimeters of steel at its thickest point, a long gun jutting forward like an accusation. 6 tons total. In a war where the other side fielded T-34s that had conquered Berlin and T-54s that defined the Cold War arms race, the Noddy Car was what South Africa had. And the Noddy Car was enough. To understand why the eland existed, you need to understand the corner South Africa had painted itself into by 1959. The Defense Force was still running British Daimler Ferret scout cars from World War II. Single machine gun, starved of spare parts. A strategic assessment concluded that the wars South Africa would actually fight would not be in Europe. They would cross vast semi-arid terrain where tracked vehicles were slow, and the difference between winning and losing came down to who could move faster and shoot straighter at the moment of contact. 3 vehicles were evaluated: the British Elvis Saladin, the Panhard EBR, and the Panhard AML. The AML won. In July 1961, Defense Minister Jim Fouché and Commandant General Peter Grobelaar flew to Paris. The deal they negotiated was not a simple purchase. 100 complete AML armored cars, plus turrets, plus components, plus a full production license for 800 more vehicles to be built inside South Africa. The contract went to Sandock Austral at Boksburg and Durban. The first locally assembled vehicles, designated Elanded Mark II, rolled off the line in July 1963. They were immediately rejected. All 56 sent back for complete disassembly and rebuild. South African tolerances had not matched French standards. The engineers went back to work. They did not stop improving it for the next 23 years. By 1967, 2/3 of components were locally sourced. By 1970, 500 elands were in service. The most consequential modification came with the Mark IV. The original Panhard air-cooled engine overheated catastrophically in African conditions. Crews reported temperatures that made the vehicle undrivable by mid-afternoon. South Africa replaced it with the Chevrolet 15-3, a water-cooled inline-4 originally designed for the Chevrolet Nova, built locally by General Motors South Africa. Engineers reconstructed the entire rear hull section and mounted the engine on sliding rails. A complete field replacement took 40 minutes. That figure was not theoretical. It was a combat requirement, written in the heat of Angola. By 1979, South Africa manufactured 95% of the vehicle domestically. The gun, the mortar, the optics, every round of ammunition. The UN had imposed a voluntary arms embargo in 1963, tightened it in 1970, made it mandatory under Chapter 7 in November 1977. South Africa had built the factory and trained the engineers before the door slammed shut. The final vehicle, 6 tons, combat-ready, 90 to 100 kilometers per hour maximum road speed, 450 kilometers range, 12 millimeters of armor, 29 rounds of 90 millimeter ammunition. Every round carried a shaped charge warhead, penetrating 320 millimeters of rolled steel independent of range and velocity. A BRDM-2 carried 14 millimeters of protection, a BTR-60 carried 11, a T-34-85 carried 90 at its thickest point. On paper, the Eland's gun could kill every one of them with a single round. In practice, it did exactly that, again and again. Operation Savannah. October 1975, 3,000 South African soldiers, in unmarked uniforms, no identification, fighting for a country that officially denied they were there. 22 Eland 90s spearheaded the advance. Task Force Zulu covered 3,159 kilometers in 33 days and knocked out 7 enemy armored vehicles at Katgang in the war's first armor versus armor battle. Cuban General Abelardo Colomé Ibarra later wrote that his inability to counter the Eland's speed and maneuverability was among his greatest tactical frustrations of the entire campaign. A general commanding a Soviet-equipped expeditionary force, writing in his after-action report that a 6-ton wheeled car had frustrated him more than anything else. The Noddy Car had just made its first general weep. Then came Ibo, and the war stopped being a story about easy victories. November 23, 1975. Battle Group Foxbat attempted to bypass a blown bridge through the town of Ibo. Cuban and Angolan forces had prepared the ambush with meticulous care. When Lieutenant Johann de Toit's Ayelen reached the bridge, a 75mm recoilless rifle on high ground put a round through the turret. Trooper Neil Lombard was killed instantly. 3 more Ayelens were struck by RPGs from foxholes at 60 meters. A BM-21 Grad salvo from 2,500 meters obliterated the mortar platoon in a single strike. Captain Holm was killed in his turret directing the withdrawal. 5 Ayelens destroyed. 2 captured and exhibited as trophies. De Toit escaped on foot that night, 12 hours after the ambush. His crews called him Magnet Ars from that day forward, and he wore the name with pride. The redemption came 19 days later. December 12th, 12 Eland 90s crossed the rebuilt bridge under the heaviest artillery barrage of the operation. Lieutenant Van Voren's troop encountered a Soviet truck of Cuban soldiers using indicator lights to pass through the column in the dust and chaos. Van Voren let the truck overtake him. Then he put a 90mm round through its rear. He subsequently ran out of ammunition, encountered 20 more Cuban soldiers in a farmhouse, closed his hatches, and shot 11 of them through the turret hatch with his service pistol. South African casualties at Bridge 14, 4 dead, Cuban and Angolan losses, 200 to 400 killed. 6 days later, December 18th, an Eland troop reconnoitering river crossings identified 3 T-34-85 tanks dug into the opposite bank. Cuban crews trained soldiers on Soviet armor. The T-34-85 had defeated the Wehrmacht. Its cannon had fired the last shots of the Battle of Berlin. It was the tank that had won World War II. A single Eland moved forward, leveled its gun, and put 1 heat round through the lead T-34's turret. The turret came off. The other 2 tanks withdrew. A 6-ton wheeled car had just killed the tank that won the Second World War, and in the turret, the crew barely had room to reload. Operation Protea, August 1981. The Eland's finest hour. 5,000 soldiers in 4 battle groups struck Angolan and Swapo bases at Xangongo and Ongiva. Eland 90 troops found T-34s used as static artillery. Hulls dug into revetments facing south. The South Africans attacked from the north. 3 T-34s burned before their crews could traverse to respond. An officer present recorded it. A small, odd-looking armored car barreling toward the enemy at top speed, stopping in the open at 80 meters, waiting 2 seconds, firing 1 shot. The T-34's turret was off to one side when the smoke cleared. He had never seen anything killed so cleanly, so quickly, by something that looked so incapable of killing. Operation Protea netted over 3,000 tons of Soviet military hardware. Among the bodies at the overrun headquarters at Xangongo, 4 Soviet military advisors. The limits, when they arrived, were honest. Operation Askari, December 1983. At Kuvalai, Elands were counterattacked by T-54 and T-55 tanks, frontal armor approaching 200 millimeters. The Eland's penetration was theoretically sufficient, but in a night engagement against moving targets, requiring the vehicle to halt before firing, with only 29 rounds, it was not enough. The gunners ran out of ammunition before they ran out of targets. The post-operation report was unsparing. The Eland could not stand up to T-54 and T-55 tanks. It was removed from conventional armored combat. The anti-armor role passed to the Rattle 90. The Noddy Car had found its ceiling. It had spent 8 years finding it. The ceiling was higher than anyone expected. The last major action, October 5, 1987, Eland 90s destroyed an Angolan motorized column north of Angiva. June 27, 1988, a Cuban MiG-23 destroyed one of the last combat-deployed Elands at Kalueke Dam, killing 11 South Africans. The Eland retired in 1994, replaced by the rewrote, 28 tons, stabilized gun, laser rangefinder, accurate at 120 kilometers per hour, superior in every measurable respect. It also could not fit inside a Hercules transport. The Eland weighed 6 tons and could be flown anywhere in Africa within hours. Some tactical problems can only be solved by a vehicle small enough to disappear into the bush and fast enough to outrun everything it cannot outfight. Morocco received the largest export consignment and deployed Elaner in the Western Sahara War until September 1979, when Moroccan crews were sent through a narrow valley against the explicit advice of South African instructors who had walked the ground. The Polisario ambushed the column and captured over 30 intact vehicles, several still bearing Afrikaans inscriptions on their fuel caps. After that, something quietly remarkable happened. Panhard began sourcing spare parts for the original AML from South Africa. The company that created the design was buying components from the country that had copied it. In a factory in Boksburg in July 1963, the first locally assembled Eland was rejected and sent back for rebuilding. It looked wrong, too light, engine overheated, steel too thin. Every criticism was correct. No night vision, no stabilizer, no laser rangefinder, no ability to fire on the move. Its armor could be penetrated by a heavy machine gun at close range. It carried fewer than 30 rounds and had to stop completely to aim. And yet, at 80 meters from a T-34 that had won the Second World War, a crew of South African teenagers fired once and ended the argument. Cuban General Abelardo Colomé Ibarra wrote that it frustrated him more than anything else he faced in Angola. Not the artillery, not the air support, the Noddy Car, 6 tons, 12 millimeters of steel, 1 round, that was enough.